Hello, welcome to another edition of the Pace Report. I'm Brian Pace, reporting live here at Smoke here in New York City. Tonight, blessing the band stage is the legendary Dr. Eddie Henderson. And Dr. Henderson's been one of the most unsung heroes in jazz music, backing the likes of the legendary Herbie Hancock, to McCoy Tyner, to Art Blakey, endless names and luminaries of this music. What people really don't know is that Dr. Henderson was also a psychiatrist, and over the last 40 years, he's not only practiced psychiatry, but he's dedicated his life to music. We sat down earlier and we talked about his origins growing up in the Bay Area. We talked about some of his mentors, including the legendary Miles Davis, as well as Freddie Hubbard, as well as Lee Morgan. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the sounds of Dr. Eddie Henderson and his quintet live here at Smoke here in New York City. Doc, I have to say, that band that you have at Smoke, I mean, Javon Jackson, Carl Allen, Dan Weiss, this was just, you know, many, many years in the making, and it's like you have never lost your chops at all. How you feel?
Well, thank you, first of all, so much. You know, all those guys that you mentioned were hand-picked because, you know, whenever I do get a gig, I try to get the best quality of musicians that I know, not to make me sound good, but to make the music sound good. I learned that type of you know, astute awareness from watching Miles Davis hire his groups. Of course, he sounded good, but he always tried to make the music sound good. That's the first priority, and you know, by that axiom, you know, I tried to pick all the bands under my bands whenever I get a gig. And in order to have a band, you have to have an itinerary. Right. So when I'm the figurehead leader, I try to get the best people I can to make the whole musical experience the best.
Musically, you know, you started off as an academic back in the Bay Area, but you, throughout your career, have had some of the most important as well as influential musical teachers to help you out career. Tell me how you got exposed to the trumpet. And
okay. Well, you know, let me start off with saying my mother was in the original Cotton Club, and I don't know how many of the listening audience have ever seen the videotape of Fats Waller, who wrote Ain't Misbehavin', and there's a famous videotape shown worldwide of Fats Waller with a real pretty lady sitting on the piano singing to Fats Waller, Ain't Misbehavin'. Well, that was my mother. And she was in the original Cotton Club, and Billie Holiday was her roommate in the Cotton Club. Lena Horne was her best friend. So ever since I was a little boy, and my father, he was who died when I was 9 years old, he was in the most famous Negro, they would call it Negro, not black singing group, in this country called the Charioteers, and they were more popular than the Ink Spots or the Mills Brothers in the 40s. Well, by virtue of my mother and father being in show business, and they knew everybody in show business, you know, I would see all these famous people like Duke Ellington, Count Basie, you know, all those kind of people, Louis Armstrong, all those people, and I just thought that Dizzy Gillespie, they would come over the house to visit my mother, you know, and my father, and I thought they were just normal people. I remember when I was 9 years old, my mother took me down. This is my first exposure to music, me playing an instrument myself, and my mother took me backstage to see Louis Armstrong, and on his trumpet was my first 2 private lessons in person from Louis Armstrong on his trumpet. He taught me how to make a sound on his trumpet, you know, and I'm 9 years old. I had no idea the stature that this man held, you know. So then I took some private lessons, you know, when I was in elementary school, from the 5th grade to the 8th grade. Very good classical teacher. And I remember after about a year, I went back. My mother took me back to the Apollo, and Louis Armstrong looked at me and said, "Little Eddie, you still playing?" I said, "Yeah, man." I grabbed this trumpet and played Flight of the Bumblebee. And I remember Louis Armstrong, I could see it right in front of me. He screamed and fell back off his chair and got back up and said, "Man, that's some of the best stuff I ever heard in my life," and told his wife to go get one of his books with 10 of his solos transcribed. And I still have the book somewhere around here. And at the top it says, "To Little Eddie, this is to warm your chops up by. You sound wonderful. Keep playing. Love, Satchmo." But I'm 10 years old. I just, who's this cat? You know, I had no idea. And then as time and events went on, my mother remarried this famous doctor out in San Francisco, who all his patients were the famous jazz musicians, like Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Cannonball, Count Basie, Duke Ellington. You know, they would always come over the house. But I'm going to the conservatory at this time. So when I was a junior in high school in San Francisco, I come home from the conservatory one day, and guess who's staying at the house the whole week? Miles Davis. And I didn't know. I heard of his name, but I didn't know who he was. And this is when he had Coltrane and Cannonball in the group, you know. And so Miles took me to the gig. This is at the Black Hawk, that famous record, Live at the Black Hawk. He took me, just Miles Davis and myself. They were there for 2 weeks. He took me every night. That's when the light went on. Boy, I said to myself, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. When I saw that stuff, hey, hey, hey. And from that point on, you know, I've been on the path trying to learn that ethnic tradition of how to play jazz music.
Dr. Henderson, one of the things that has been really one of the most beneficial is the fact that you were an academic. You were very learned as well as a studied musician too, but you also chose two different patterns. You wanted to play music, but you also decided to go into another route and follow and practice medicine.
Well, that was because my stepfather, he was a doctor, and he and I did not get along that well. And he told me when I was 14 years old that he was a doctor and that was the closest thing to God, and I was just going to be a bum on the waterfront. And he said it to the wrong person. I just wanted to play music, you know. But when he said that to me, I said, "Oh yeah, watch." And so I went out of my way to, you know, to go to medical school just to prove him wrong. You know, it worked out wonderful, you know. So, you know, the practice of medicine and the practice of music are two wonderful disciplines, you know. And I was lucky enough and had the aptitude enough to finish medical school and practice medicine, and then by the grace of God had the door open, had the opportunity to be hired by Herbie Hancock at the end of my psychiatric residency. You know, to tell you the truth, I really didn't want to be a psychiatrist, but after I finished my internship, medical school, got my MD, and had a choice of picking a residency like surgery, pediatrics, gynecology, which each had an on-call schedule of once every other day for 4 or 5 years, as opposed to psychiatry, on-call schedule was once every 45 days. I said, "Ooh, this gives me more of a chance to play my horn." So I picked psychiatry, and at the end of the psychiatric residency, Herbie Hancock just happened to need a trumpet player because his regular trumpet player, Johnny Coles, was on sabbatical with Ray Charles, and so he hired me for the 1 week. That 1 week in San Francisco at a club called the Both And Club, and that 1 week turned into the rest of my life until up to the present time.
One of the things that we talked about on the bandstand at Smoke was that you had one of the, you know, you were the last of those great musicians that got to learn from some of the greatest musicians on the bandstand. And I want to kind of ask you a couple of questions because from what I understand, when you were studying medicine at Howard University, you used to trek up to New York City, and you used to study with two of the most important trumpet players of your generation.
That's right. Well, you know, I fell in love with the playing of Lee Morgan and Freddie Hubbard, and so when I was going to school in Washington, D.C., every weekend, from Friday night until Monday morning, I'd drive up to New York because my parents still had the house in New York, so I'd stay at home, you know, where I grew up in New York. And every Saturday morning, I'd be at Freddie Hubbard's house to him to show me things. I'd take him club hopping, go to all his gigs, and every Sunday morning, I'd be at Lee Morgan's house, go club hopping with him. I became very good friends with both of them, and you know, I tried to emulate their playing, and that was really a big part of my musical growth during those formative years when I was just learning the craft of jazz. And plus that was such an active period in the mid '60s in New York because Coltrane was on the scene, Freddie Hubbard, Max Roach, Booker Little, all the greats. You know, you just walk from one corner to the other. Yeah, and at that time the music was up in Harlem. It wasn't downtown like it is nowadays. And boy, it was a wonder that I did finish medical school because, you know, I was so inspired, you know, and all the guys in medical school used to tell me, "Ooh, man, you're going to flunk out because you're playing jazz every night." I said, well, you know, if I flunk out, but I would go to school every day. I never missed a class in my life. These guys were telling me I was going to flunk out. You know, they'd be partying, wouldn't come to class for 2 and 3 months, then try to cram for the test. They flunked out, you know, but I told them if I flunk out of medical school, I just have to flunk out, but I have to do this. I have to play this trumpet, and thank God, you know, I passed because I was diligent in my study habits. You know, I passed and still playing too.
Everyone knows about your affiliation with Herbie Hancock, and when you joined Herbie's group, jazz music was going through another metamorphosis. Yeah. Fusion jazz was coming into its end.
Yes, it was. You know, the Herbie Hancock group that I was in is also called the Mwandishi group. Well, the Mwandishi was the the Swahili name that everybody in the band gave to Herbie, and everybody in the band had a Swahili name. I was Mganga Ashauri. Everybody in the band gave the other members the individual names according to their personal characteristics as they saw it. Mwandishi means composer, which Herbie Hancock is Grandmaster Composer. I was Mganga, that meant doctor. Bennie Maupin was Mwile, that meant body of good health. Billy Hart was Jabali, that meant inner strength. Buster Williams, Mchezaji, that meant player. Who else was there? Billy Hart, Herbie, Buster. Julian Priester was Pepo Mtoto, spirit child. Well, when I first joined that group, the band was, at that time, everybody was new in the band except Buster, because previously you had like Tootie Heath, Joe Henderson, Garnett Brown, and I forgot the bass player. But they were playing music like for Fat Albert Rotunda, that kind of boogaloo stuff. You know, so when the Mwandishi Band first, it wasn't the Mwandishi Band when we first got together. For the first 2 months, we were playing the old repertoire, Fat Albert Rotunda, and that kind of stuff. Speak Like a Child, Maiden Voyage, of course. And then we got a gig in Chicago for a month at the London House, and something happened. Julian Priester brought in a tune called Wandering Spirit Song, and bingo, the whole concept of the band changed to that, space. And that's when somebody in the band called it the Mwandishi. No, somebody in the audience, that's the Mwandishi Band, and that's what we were called thereafter.
Did you like the transition, because you studied with the great bop legends, and then now you're going into this electric mode, and then after you left Herbie, you recorded a couple of fusion records too. I mean, did you enjoy that period, or were you kind of just going with the tide?
Well, you know what? When you say I studied with the bop legends, I was just learning the basic building blocks of how to improvise. When I studied with Lee and Freddie, I really never got that aspect together at that time. So when I joined Herbie, it immediately jumped off into the M1D space thing, and I was comfortable. Space cadet. Everybody was space cadets then. I could play anything, and the way Herbie played, every note I played made it sound good. If I just said bap, he'd make that sound good. And so I was like a little boy in a candy store. When Herbie broke up the band and changed, because of financial reasons, he was broke and he had to make a change. That's when he got headhunters. I was angry at him. I wouldn't even speak to him for a couple of years. I was really irate. So I thought that band was going to last forever, But nothing lasts forever. And then, as you mentioned, I started doing, fusion type of records. That was not my idea. That was, because I was just such a novice. I got the producer, which was Norman Connor's producer, Skip Drinkwater. He acquired a contract on Blue Note, on Capitol Records first, and then my first 2 records in Capitol, I hired the Mwandishi Band. It sounded just like the Mwandishi Band, even more than Herbie's records. That was Realization and Inside Out album, and then he got a record contract with Blue Note. What they call that? I can't think of the name of the type of contract. It was more or less a contract where he hired all the musicians. So he hired all these funk and Paul Jacksons and stuff, and I think Herbie or Patrice Rushen and stuff. And he bought all this wah-wahs and echoplexes and phase shifters. They bought it. I didn't know, and I just had a lucky day. It worked out, because that's a science you have to really study. But somehow it worked out all right on the record. I just got all that equipment the day before the record date. But it synchronized with the track and everything. Sounded like I knew what I was doing. I was just learning, And that was my first exposure to being a fusion musician. I played the same way as I did, really, with the Mwandishi group, but the difference was I was in a funk oriented rhythm section. That's just like Miles Davis. They say he changed his style. He didn't change his style. He just put himself in a different musical atmosphere. Sound like he changed his style. But if you listen to Miles's records, he sounded the same, but just the atmosphere was different. Now people are saying, well, I was a fusion player. I wasn't really a fusion player. I had fusion rhythm section. Sounded like I could play fusion. I was just a beginner, to be truthful.
Because, you know, those records right now, in your electric and your fusion period, right, those are serious records overseas. I mean, those guys put those records on a high pedestal.
I know. Do you know, in London, one of the tracks called Cyclops or Prance On, to this day, that was back in the 70s, to this day, young kids, when I go to London, young generation of kids, excuse me, Eddie Henderson, can you play Prance On, sir? It's like a cult in England. What happened is the disc jockey made a mistake. It was a 33 vinyl album. The disc jockey made a mistake and played those albums on the radio at the 45 speed during the disco era, and that was what was the hit. Wow. At the 45. See, it was a fluke accident. And then when I first heard it, I said, man, that sounds absurd. You know, but then when I listened to it in the context of a disco, it was right in the pocket. And I said, well, I'll be. Isn't that something, man?
Dr. Henderson, what does jazz music mean to you?
To me, it means, it has meant in my life everything to me. It has meant a way to express myself in a creative way. And to me, jazz music has opened up the spirituality of my being and shown me and has shown me things, intangible things, which I strive to attain in this life and to attain perfection on all levels of my life.
That'll do it again for another edition of the Pace Report. I'm Brian Pace, reporting live here at Smoke here in New York City. I'd like to personally thank Dr. Eddie Henderson for his time, as well as the staff and management here at Smoke. As always, please visit my website, www.thepacereport.com, for my weekly column as well as my past segments. Remember, next time, if it's in the groove, it'll make you move. Till next time, peace.